Every single dashboard indicator is screaming danger, and they are all triggering at the exact same moment. Never before has this nation witnessed anything like our first critical alarm. Washington is currently bleeding $128 trillion annually, solely to cover the borrowing costs on our sovereign obligations. That figure eclipses our military expenditures. It eclipses healthcare programs for seniors, veteran support, schooling, and public works combined. We are feeding more capital to the ghosts of yesterday's spending than we are investing in tomorrow's civilization. This scenario is utterly unprecedented. We did not see this prior to the Great Depression, nor during the Great Recession. Welcome to the economic of fallen empires, where we analyze how the past dictates the future. And right now, the future looks terrifying. Alarm number 2. Overseas lenders are liquidating their American debt holdings with unprecedented ferocity. Beijing has unloaded $680 billion worth over the past 48 months. Tokyo has divested $310 billion. International monetary authorities have purged $11 trillion since the start of the decade. The people who used to finance our deficits are sprinting toward the exits, and history shows us that when the financiers vanish, superpowers crumble. The third siren. The greenback summons in international central bank vaults plummeted from a commanding 71% at the turn of the millennium to 55% today. The descent is currently accelerating by half a point annually. Once that threshold breaches the midway mark, a milestone mathematically guaranteed before the end of this decade, the global foundation shatters. The fiat currency we rely on loses its monopoly status, and once that anchor snaps, the entire geopolitical paradigm shifts. Our fourth indicator: nearly half of the fiat currency ever conjured into existence was generated within just the past 4 months. 47% of the greenback's 2.5-century volume materialized out of thin air since the pandemic era began. That is not economic relief. That is sheer panic. That reveals a bureaucratic apparatus completely incapable of funding its operations through legitimate taxation, turning instead to the printing presses, artificially inflating a currency to mask insolvency guarantees exactly one historical destination: total ruin. The fifth and final omen: federal bean counters calculate that a mere 8 years from now, covering the yield on our obligations, will devour half of all national tax receipts. 50 cents of every dollar confiscated from citizens will simply service the interest to entities that floated us cash in yesteryears. When that threshold is crossed, the federal apparatus transforms into a glorified collection agency for bondholders, rather than a working legislative body. These are not pessimistic guesses or dystopian fantasies. These are mathematical certainties pulled directly from official ledgers, and every single one of these 5 alarms is ringing loudly today. While our republic has never navigated these treacherous waters, simultaneously humanity absolutely has. The Spanish dynasty walked this precise path when these exact 5 omens materialized in Madrid. Their global hegemony evaporated in under 3 decades. Back in the middle of the 16th century, the Spanish realm was the undisputed titan of the globe. They commanded vast landmasses, endless raw materials, and fortunes that dwarfed any prior civilization. Their secret weapon was unparalleled, a seemingly infinite torrent of raw silver erupting from freshly conquered lands. They accumulated veritable mountains of it. The monarchy believed its reign was indestructible, assuming the subterranean riches were bottomless. Consequently, Madrid took out massive loans against unmined precious metals, squandering the capital on foreign conflicts and imperial expansion. Then the extraction slowed, the obligations swelled beyond repayment capability, and the monarchy breached its financial contracts half a dozen times within a 90-year window. The resulting devastation was absolute. The engine of their undoing was hardly magic, it was a mathematical certainty. Initially, a deluge of liquidity sparked rampant price hikes, hollowing out domestic manufacturing. Subsequently, leadership leveraged anticipated future income, blindly trusting the endless bounty. Finally, the influx of wealth stagnated compounded past the breaking point, and financial surrender commenced. The Iberian Giant endured this exact cycle over a single century, peaking and crashing between the mid-1500s and mid-1600s. Today, however, superpowers disintegrate at a terrifying velocity. Digital data travels instantaneously, and capital shifts borders in fractions of a second. A decline that required 100 years for Madrid and 3 decades for London will likely conclude here in half that time. We currently sit firmly inside the second phase of this doom loop. Yet the dashboard indicators scream a contradictory truth. Expansion is decelerating, investors are fleeing, and you cannot inflate a currency into infinity. Materializes, it will not drag out over generations. It will detonate in a matter of weeks, perhaps days. Because the interconnected banking matrix relies solely on faith. When faith evaporates, it never returns, as we constantly explore here on the Economic of Fallen. Empires understanding the ghosts of the past is the only way to survive the specters of the future. Failing to comprehend the Iberian precedent leaves us totally blind to our impending reality. Once the disaster is universally acknowledged, your window to brace for impact will have already slammed shut. This 16th century tale is not dusty trivia. It is a precise schematic, and our nation is tracing the blueprint perfectly. To grasp the bottom, we must look at the zenith. The Spanish Empire in the 16th century dominated every conceivable metric. Their flags flew across 5 distinct landmasses in the European theater. They held the Iberian Peninsula, the Low Countries, slices of the Italian Peninsula, and maintained deep ties to the Holy Roman Throne across the Atlantic. Their reach stretched from what is now California down through the southern tip of South America. They held territories in the Pacific and footholds across North Africa. Yet dirt and borders did not constitute their actual might. Unrefined metal did, overtaking. Indigenous empires in the early 1500s gifted Madrid the hoarded treasures of highly advanced societies. But the subterranean deposits proved infinitely more lucrative high in the Andes. Explorers stumbled upon an unprecedented mountain of silver. That singular geographical anomaly would pump out 3/5 of the globe's precious metal supply for a century. By the mid-1500s, galleons were ferrying roughly 300 metric tons of it across the ocean annually. To contextualize that scale, that volume of metal, translated to roughly 150 million regional coins. Meanwhile, the monarchy's domestic taxation efforts managed to scrape together a mere 6 million. Their imported unearned wealth dwarfed their organic economic base by a factor of 25. They had essentially hit a geological jackpot. This endless capital financed the most lethal armed forces on the continent. Their elite infantry units wielding long spears and early firearms completely dominated battlefields for generations. Their armadas ruled the waves. Empowered by endless funds to compensate mercenaries and construct galleons. Financiers from across the continent descended upon their cities eager to offer favorable terms, to the crown completely blinded by the illusion that the endless metallic shipments nullified any risk of default. Any aristocratic financier seeking a guaranteed yield parked their capital with Madrid. They appeared godlike, yet that very metal was corroding their foundation from the inside out completely undetected. Triggered by the monetary flood, before this deluge, their marketplaces enjoyed stable valuations. A laborer's daily sweat earned a predictable wage. When an overflowing currency supply chases a stagnant pool of resources, costs skyrocket. Valuations quadrupled before the century ended. A basic necessity that cost a single coin at the start demanded four by the conclusion. This annihilated anyone relying on a static income, which encompassed the vast majority of the citizenry: working-class folks, military personnel, and civil servants watched their purchasing power evaporate daily. The very treasure that promised utopia was hollowing out their standard of living. Furthermore, this inflationary pressure did not remain quarantined. The metal bled across borders to finance foreign goods and military campaigns. Their domestic agrarian sector was primitive. Their industrial capacity was pitiful. They outsourced their survival, purchasing Sicilian wheat, British textiles, and Germanic armaments. Consequently, the currency diluted across the continent, doubling costs everywhere it traveled. Their domestically crafted goods became artificially exorbitant compared to foreign alternatives. Local artisans could not match the aggressive pricing of their neighbors. The empire morphed into a consumption-only state, perpetually draining its reserves to import necessities. It became an inescapable trap. Greater wealth inflows guaranteed deeper industrial decay simultaneously. Their sovereign was hemorrhaging capital on endless combat. The crown fought violently to preserve its continental holdings, crush rebellions, block Eastern empires in the Mediterranean, and fund ideological proxies abroad. Their monarch was locked in perpetual warfare, mobilizing troops, mandates, heavy compensation, advanced naval construction, massive explosive manufacturing, and complex logistical networks. During this era, defense expenditures devoured roughly 3/4 of the royal treasury's total intake. 75 cents of every coin vanished into the theater of war, instantly starving the domestic sector of crucial upgrades, public works, and industrial maturation. Then came the lethal miscalculation. They started pawning their unmined future, realizing the oceanic shipments would likely persist for decades. The royal court began treating subterranean unextracted ore as liquid assets. The lenders eagerly signed, trusting the Andean mountains to deliver. This arrangement functioned, temporarily allowing the empire to consume capital it had not yet acquired. Palaces were erected and armies deployed without waiting for the physical treasure to dock. However, this birthed a terrifying vulnerability. They were incinerating tomorrow's prosperity. Any hiccup in the extraction process, any maritime disaster, or any geopolitical blockade meant the entire house of cards would implode by the turn of the 17th century. The royal ledger showed a negative balance equivalent to 8.5 times their annual intake. For perspective, modern America owes roughly $36.5 trillion against barely $5 trillion in receipts. Our ratio currently sits at 7.4. Our nation is remarkably close to the precipice that doomed the Spanish, and our deficit is expanding relentlessly. Over 4 decades into their experiment, the Iberian monarchy was feeding over 40% of its total revenue directly to interest payments. They were imprisoned in an obligation vortex, securing fresh capital merely to satisfy the penalties on legacy loans, to bankroll conflicts, and to plug gaping holes in the treasury. Financiers continued to feed the beast, entirely captivated by the illusion of infinite resources. But the geology eventually betrayed them. These certificates are contractual promises to compensate buyers utilizing future citizen taxation. Bureaucrats are incinerating wealth right now, under the delusion that GDP will perpetually expand, generating sufficient capital to make bondholders whole. Today, however, our carrying costs alone demand $128 trillion, annually obliterating 26% of all federal receipts. Madrid hit 40% right before the floor gave out. The final phase of annihilation commenced as the 17th century unfolded. The subterranean bounty began to dry up. Extracting the remaining ore demanded immense labor. Complex engineering and exorbitant funding yields peaked and plunged into a terminal dive, shrinking by half over the ensuing decades. Concurrently, the ocean began claiming its share. Brutal weather and coordinated piracy battered the supply lines. Rival maritime powers relentlessly hunted their cargo vessels. When an opposing admiral hijacked an entire convoy in the late 1620s, an entire year's worth of economic lifeblood vanished in a single afternoon. Devoid of incoming capital, the monarchy could not honor its pledges. The era of broken promises began. The initial catastrophic failure to pay occurred in the mid-1550s. Owing massive sums, the king simply froze all remittances and mandated a severe restructuring. Lenders swallowed horrific haircuts, exchanging short-duration notes for long-term paper yielding pennies on the dollar. This shattered the empire's financial reputation. Borrowing costs skyrocketed. A nation previously enjoying single-digit interest suddenly faced double-digit extortion. A mere 18 years later, history repeated itself. The deficit had ballooned further because the addiction to spending never ceased. Another freeze was declared, driving interest penalties toward 20%. Lending to the crown was now akin to gambling. The third breach of trust arrived roughly 20 years later. By this juncture, global financiers had finally absorbed the lesson. Major banking dynasties completely severed ties with the monarchy, relocating their assets to stable jurisdictions. The empire found itself isolated from global liquidity pools. The fourth financial betrayal occurred under the subsequent monarch. The royal coffers were in perpetual distress. Extraction yields plummeted annually, yet combat expenditures remained massive due to endless foreign quagmires. The math simply did not compute, forcing another round of forced creditor losses. A fifth incident struck 2 decades later, amid one of the bloodiest continental struggles in history. The financial strain was astronomical. The crown failed to compensate its own legions, triggering mass insurrections. The domestic marketplace was a wasteland. Taxation yielded nothing. Investors were completely obliterated again. The sixth major failure arrived 20 years after that. At this stage, the empire was a hollow shell. The domestic economy was decimated. Transatlantic shipments were a tiny fraction of their former glory. Their once legendary armed forces were entirely declawed. Their European footprint had shrunk massively, yet the monarchy remained destitute. Half a dozen bankruptcies over a 90-year span. Roughly every decade and a half, they ripped up their contracts and started over. Each betrayal guaranteed the next by vaporizing trust and multiplying the cost of securing fresh funds. What was the root cause? How did limitless capital engineer poverty? The reality is, they committed 3 fatal errors, and our nation is actively replicating every single one of them. Error 1: misinterpreting currency for actual riches. They assumed holding precious metals equated to wealth. But genuine wealth is the capacity to create. It is industrial infrastructure, agricultural efficiency, highly trained minds, and the ability to manufacture necessities the globe desperately needs. They held currency, but built nothing. They outsourced their existence. Their domestic capabilities were laughable. They produced absolutely nothing of value for the international market. They were overflowing with cash, but bankrupt in utility. Once the monetary influx paused, they had zero foundation to rely upon. They could not innovate their way out of the abyss. They could only default, error 2: mortgaging tomorrow. They acquired funds, betting that the good times would never end. The yields were massive, so they foolishly projected that reality forward into infinity. They constructed opulent estates and launched armadas using phantom money. When the supply chain fractured, the obligations remained. The promised collateral evaporated, leaving the ledgers hopelessly unbalanced. This is the ultimate hazard of credit. Leveraging the future mandates uninterrupted expansion. The moment progress stalls or the calculus shifts, the architecture collapses. Error 3. Chronic militarism earmarking. 3/4 of all incoming capital for battlefield operations starved the homeland. The crown had zero bandwidth to modernize supply chains, subsidize innovation, or optimize farming, because every spare coin was fed into the war machine. These conflicts, designed to project strength and secure dominance, ironically cannibalized the very foundation required for enduring supremacy. They emerged victorious in skirmishes, but utterly forfeited the macroeconomic campaign. Allow me to outline exactly how our nation is mirroring these three blunders today. We are currently committing the first fatal error. Washington operates under the delusion that controlling the global reserve instrument, the fiat dollar, grants us intrinsic wealth. This privilege permits us to keystroke currency into existence and force the international community to absorb it. This is our modern-day Andean silver mine. It is a massive unearned tailwind. But mirroring the Iberian monarchs, we refuse to cultivate tangible production. Our industrial base was exported to the Far East long ago. We barely fabricate the essentials we rely upon daily. Our physical frameworks, the highways, the viaducts, the utility grids, are severely decaying. Our GDP relies heavily on moving digits on screens rather than assembling physical goods. Financial hubs engineer profits by shuffling contracts, while tech sectors code digital distractions. We have forfeited the muscle memory of building real things. Once the international community rejects our paper, once our monopoly status evaporates, we will hit rock bottom. We cannot code or trade our way out of a sovereign debt crisis. We are aggressively committing the second error. We are taking out massive loans against the earnings of unborn taxpayers. Our sovereign bonds are IOUs, reliant on the assumption of uninterrupted perpetual domestic expansion to generate the taxes required to clear the ledger, but with obligations surpassing 36 trillion and receipts hovering near 5 trillion. Our liability-to-income ratio is terrifyingly close to the Iberian breaking point. And much like those fallen monarchs, we are caught in a lethal whirlpool. The carrying costs on our liabilities are demanding over $1 trillion annually, incinerating 1/4 of all incoming revenue. Previous decades saw this figure resting comfortably in the teens. Now it is accelerating. The experts project that inside of a decade, 50% of all collected taxes will vanish instantly to satisfy past debts. Half of our national income will evaporate before funding a single social program, defensive initiative, or public work. We are also deeply entrenched in the third error. We are addicted to perpetual overseas conflicts. The multi-decade military campaigns initiated at the dawn of the millennium have drained north of $8 trillion from our collective wealth, encompassing battlefield operations, counterinsurgency efforts, and lifetime medical care for our warriors. We maintain operational footprints in dozens of sovereign nations, operating hundreds of installations. The annual defensive expenditure flirts with $1 trillion. While it hasn't eclipsed 75% of our budget, it represents a catastrophic diversion of resources. Like the royal campaigns of old, these modern engagements incinerate wealth rather than compound it. They burned through trillions without delivering a single tangible economic dividend. The maintenance of our global garrison is a financial black hole. The mechanics are eerily identical. Madrid leveraged unmined ore. The ore vanished. Madrid failed to pay and broke their contracts repeatedly. Washington is leveraging uncollected taxes. Domestic expansion is cooling. Tax receipt growth is stalling. Our baseline assumptions are fracturing. Our nation will also fail to pay, though not through a formal bankruptcy proceeding. We will execute a stealth default via currency debasement. The central banking authority will digitally conjure trillions to absorb the sovereign paper the free market rejects. This inevitably dilutes the purchasing power of the fiat unit. The obligations will be cleared using currency that commands a fraction of its original value. It is a covert restructuring, but the end result is identical. The lenders suffer the chon, institutional investors suffer, and the everyday citizens holding the currency are impoverished. The signals are blindingly obvious. Let's trace them back to the European precedent Signal 1, carrying costs dominating the ledger. The 16th century monarchs crossed this Rubicon right before their third catastrophic failure. When debt maintenance swallows the treasury, the state is paralyzed. It can no longer build or advance. It exists purely to satisfy lenders. Washington crossed this identical threshold recently. Debt service is now the paramount line item on the federal budget. This is the hallmark of a decaying superpower. Signal 2, the exodus of capital. During the late 1500s, elite financial families began cutting their ties with the monarchy, sensing the impending doom. By the time the third bankruptcy hit, the smart money was already gone. We are witnessing this exact phenomena today, Eastern superpowers and global banking consortiums have liquidated trillions in American paper since the start of the decade. The smart money is sprinting away. This is not routine portfolio management. It is a full-blown evacuation. Signal 3, the loss of monopoly status. The silver-backed Iberian coin was the undisputed king of international commerce, but chronic broken promises annihilated its reputation. Eventually, merchants demanded alternative stable currencies. The American greenback is tracing this precise trajectory. Its dominance in global vaults is shrinking. International commerce is fragmenting into competing Eastern currencies and multinational alliances. Once our fiat drops below the halfway mark of global reserves, a mathematical certainty, in a few short years, the network advantage implodes, triggering a rapid freefall. Signal 4, aggressive dilution. The fallen monarchs began stamping coins with increasingly cheaper base metals to stretch their depleted silver reserves. This was their crude version of a printing press. It allowed them to settle debts with inferior money, but it shattered public faith. Decades later, their currency was virtually worthless. We are executing the exact same maneuver. Creating nearly half of our historical money supply in 4 years is the modern equivalent of shaving silver coins. It is pure debasement. It breeds massive cost of living spikes, and it annihilates institutional trust. Signal 5, the tipping point of debt service. The old empire hit the 50% revenue mark early in the 17th century, ceasing to function as a sovereign state and morphing into a pure debt repayment vehicle. Projections place us at that exact terrifying milestone within 8 years. At that juncture, the system is mathematically insolvent. There will be zero bandwidth for civic obligations, pensions, or defense. Every single red flag that prefaced the European catastrophe is currently waving violently in our own backyard. The historical rhythm is precise and unambiguous. The Iberian collapses arrived in distinct waves spaced roughly 15 years apart. Every breach of trust amplified the probability of the next elevating borrowing costs and incinerating domestic prosperity. We experienced our own tremor a decade and a half ago during the banking panic. The next massive fault line will rupture in a few short years when entitlement trust funds run dry and mandatory austerity kicks in. Another will detonate when the next economic contraction strikes, pushing annual shortfalls past the $3 trillion mark. The domino effect of cascading disasters is already in motion, adjusting the historical timeline for the hyperspeed of modern digital finance. We likely have under a decade before a massive covert restructuring or currency event strikes. Their unraveling took the better part of a century. However, that was an era of wind-powered galleons and physical parchment. Today, capital transverses the globe at the speed of light. Modern panics mature in hours, not decades. What required 90 years in the past will likely compress into 2 decades today. If we consider the great mortgage crisis as ground zero, we are already deep into the endgame. As we emphasize on the economic of fallen empires, ignoring these lessons is a fatal error. The historical verdict is undeniable. The mid-16th century Spanish regime was the apex predator of the globe, wielding unprecedented capital and supreme military might. Yet they bankrupted themselves, by confusing fiat with true productivity, gambling their unearned future and bleeding their treasury on the battlefield. The very commodity that secured their dominance became the instrument of their demise. Their unpayable obligations triggered a total collapse. They faded into obscurity, gradually stripped of their global footprint until nothing remained but history. We possess the greenback. We hold the monopoly. But this paper is not intrinsic value. It is a temporary lease granted by the global community. The moment that lease is revoked and commerce shifts to rival sovereign notes, we will find ourselves mirroring the agonizing reality of the 1620s. Our massive compounding liabilities will become mathematically impossible to clear. The establishment will choose the politically palatable route of inflating the debt away, devastating the working class in the process. The indicators are screaming, this is not a drill. It is an impending mathematical reality. You face a stark decision. You can bury your head in the sand, assuming American exceptionalism suspends the laws of economics. You can blindly trust the printing press. The vast majority will choose this comforting delusion, and they will watch half their life's work vanish when the devaluation hits. Or you can acknowledge the undeniable rhythm of history. You can accept that our trajectory is identical to the fallen titans of the past. Protect your purchasing power. Transition capital into hard assets, precious metals, tangible property, or alternative stores of value that survive sovereign currency failures. Eliminate exposure to government paper. Cultivate high-income skills that remain relevant regardless of the macroeconomic weather. Fortify your position before the herd panics, because once the masses realize the ship is sinking, the lifeboats will already be gone. The Dutch guilder, the British pound, the Spanish peso, every dominant currency eventually crumbles when the host nation's productive engine can no longer carry its debts. The greenback is next. The only variable is the exact date, and the flashing alarms indicate that the hour is incredibly late. The foundational strength is evaporating, and the stealth defaults are on the horizon. The historical rhythm never lies, and the beat is pounding louder than ever right now.